A few weeks after my dad had passed away, I ran into Arlen Disselcohen. Many of you know Arlen. He's a long time one of the original members of this church. And he said something to me that was probably the truest words I could hear in the moment. And he said that there's a shock that comes to losing a loved one. And it goes like this. So he goes, you go about your day, you're driving around, and you see all these other people around you. And they're just carrying on. They're driving to and from work. They're driving to and from stores. And you've experienced this loss that's so huge that you almost want to yell at them. Don't you know? Don't you know what's happened? And for many of us, this is how this month can feel. Because on the one hand, Christmas is marching on. We've had Thanksgiving, and we've turned our hearts and our minds to Christmas. We've put up trees. We've set out decorations. We're buying presents. Some of us are planning trips. We have our calendars are filling up with concerts to attend, parties to get to. And yet, for each of us, in some way, we can look in our own lives or the world and see and know this loss and grief that's there, this disappointment that weighs on us. And sometimes it seems like nobody cares, that we're all just focused on doing the next thing, doing the same thing we do year in and year out, and just ignoring that other stuff, just ignoring the loss that we have. Some of us, that's the loss of a person. For others, that's the loss of a dream of how our family could be, a dream of how a relationship could be, the dream of what our vocation could be. We often ignore the grief around us, the stories of atrocities and hardships that we see week in and week out. And sometimes it seems like nobody cares, that we're just going to march on. We're just going to keep doing the thing that we do every year. And sometimes this feels like this is most true at church. I mean, if there's ever a place where we're going to do the same thing that we did last year that we're going to do this year, it's the church. Right? We're going to light these candles. We're going to sing these songs. We're going to hear some pretty familiar texts. But here's the difference that I hope we see in these familiar songs and texts, is that the season of Advent is exactly the season that we look at the grief and the loss. The words of Fleming Rutledge always ring and echo in my ears as we start Advent, as she says, Advent always starts in the dark. That Advent is a time where we explore this reality that we live in a land of deep darkness, as Isaiah says. And it is in that land of deep darkness that a light has dawned. For this Advent season, we're going to do a little bit of a different approach with our texts this morning. If you read the start of Matthew's gospel, it's typically something we skip over, which is the lineage from Abraham to Jesus, where it says, Abraham had this son, and then this son had this son, and this son had this son. And it goes on. And it typically goes like that. It typically just lists out the men, father to son, father to son. But in Matthew's lineage, Matthew includes 5 women, and he names 4 of them. And this is unusual, and it invites exploration. And so that's what we're going to do this Advent season, is we're going to look at the mothers of Jesus. We're going to look at the 4 women named in Matthew's lineage and see what they reveal about who Jesus is, what God has accomplished in his first and what he will accomplish in his second coming. This morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a pretty scandalous text about Tamar. And fair warning, I would rate this as a PG-13 text. And my hope is, similar to what I was just telling the kids, is that we would see God's power to overcome the darkness around this. To do this, we're going to read this fairly lengthy story found in Genesis 38. And we're going to see in it the heartache of disappointment, the sliver of grace, and then we're going to look at the whole of grace from that sliver. So let's look at our text. It's from Genesis 38, verses 6 through 30. Hear these words from the book that we love. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, the secondborn, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it, she asked. He said, what pledge shall I give you? Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son, Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you've broken out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. So this is a pretty sad story. It's not very uplifting and encouraging, but there is a sliver of grace. But to get there, we would need to start with the heartache of the many disappointments that Tamar experienced, that truthfully we all know. And for her, the first heartache of disappointment simply comes from the hand that she's been dealt. Tamar, first of all, is born a woman at a time where women weren't treated with value or dignity. Women were mainly treated as property. She had almost no say in who she was to marry. And then we read in the story that her husband dies, and she becomes a childless widow, one of the most vulnerable people in a culture and society at that time. because she was a widow. She was not desirable to be given off in marriage. She didn't have any children. So in their eyes, she was kind of a leech on the family. And there's nothing Tamar could have done about any of this. This is just the hand she was dealt. And you and I, we all have similar aspects to this in our own lives. We have just the hand that we're dealt. Things that we can't do anything about them. One aspect of this is we have no control over the family that we're born into. And we have no control then of the unique brokenness of that family that we then carry within us. One example of this from my own life was a few years ago for a class in seminary. I had to interview my dad about his own upbringing. And this is the first time that I ever really heard my dad talk about his own dad. And I found out that his dad, my grandfather, who I never met, served in World War II and carried a lot of wounds from that war into his day-to-day life that deeply impacted how he parented my dad. And the wounds then that my dad carried with him that impacted the way he parented me and my brother. And that's just the hand that I was dealt. That's the hand that my dad was dealt. And we all have similar stories. Second, we read Tamar also has the disappointment from the law. After her husband dies, we read this interesting thing where Onan, the second born, is expected to be her husband. And this is at least custom at the time. Later it would actually be written into Israel's law that this is what they were to do. And it's a good law, right? It's to help with this reality that this is a vulnerable person. And so we're going to build in this structure to help the most vulnerable. And what do we read? We read Onan abuses the law, right? Because he doesn't say no. He doesn't say, I'm not going to do it. He finds a way to follow the letter of the law, but avoid following the spirit of the law. And it comes at the cost of Tamar, right? He abuses her to get what he wants, to technically do the right thing. And so she experiences heartache from that disappointment. And we all experience disappointment from the law in a few different ways. On one hand, there is just the limitations of the law. If you or I or a loved one is hurt by someone, we immediately experience the disappointment of why wasn't this prevented? Who couldn't keep this from happening? And even in those moments, if the perpetrator is found, even if they are submitted to the justice process, it doesn't undo the pain of the loss and the suffering. The second type of disappointment with the law is that we know that the world is full of a bunch of people like Onan, who are very crafty, who are very good at finding the loopholes, of finding ways to technically follow the law, but to avoid actually following the spirit of the law. And that's frustrating and disappointing. And the third type of disappointment from the law is that we have imperfect law enforcers from the whole way. From security guards, they're imperfect. Police officers are imperfect. Juries and judges, they are imperfect. They get things wrong sometimes, and we know the disappointment that comes with that. The third heartache of disappointment that Tamar experiences is from people. And she experiences this most clearly in Judah. Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, somebody who's supposed to be upright, who's supposed to be the elder of the family, who's supposed to know the law and do the right thing, and yet he doesn't. And to me, the clearest showing of how disappointing Judah is that he's unable to send his third son as he's become of age. He's unable to send him to his daughter-in-law to fulfill his legal obligation to her. But when it comes to giving the prostitute the young goat that he owes her, he's diligent about it. He makes sure it happens the next day. He sends his friend with the young goat to fulfill that obligation. And kind of the cherry on top of the disappointment that Tamar has in Judah is that when Judah finds out that Tamar is pregnant, what does he want done to her? He wants her burned. which is the most extreme punishment that we can find at that age and at that time. And of course, I don't have to tell you, we've all experienced being disappointed by people. Particularly people like Judah, who were supposed to be upright, who were supposed to be righteous, who were supposed to be supportive and loyal, and they let us down. And this heartache of disappointment, on one hand, it's a part of life, but it's hard. It's hard to deal with this disappointment from the hands we're dealt, from the laws around us, and from the people that we trust ourselves to. But we do see a sliver of grace in our story. And the sliver of grace comes when Tamar does a desperate thing in a desperate moment, and it works. Now, it's interesting, and maybe you caught this, it's kind of odd, where Judah says, when he finds out the whole story, he says that Tamar did the righteous thing. And later in Scripture, we'll read that too, that Tamar does the righteous thing. And that's really fascinating, because if I had told you that I knew of a story about a woman who disguised herself to trick her father-in-law to sleep with her, you would probably say, like, that person doesn't get the award for Good Person of the Year. And yet that's what happens with Tamar. So why is her actions righteous? Well, in that law, where the next closest male relative is to step in for the deceased brother or deceased other relative, we see an interesting dynamic in our text. You see, once Judah decides not to send the third son, the next closest male relative is Judah himself. And Judah, as we read, had lost his wife, so he is technically an eligible bachelor to fulfill that role. And so she does the righteous thing because Judah is the next in line, and she forces his hand. Now, what's tricky here in this moment is if you and I, as most sermons, you wonder, well, what does it mean to be Tamar today? I don't know. I have no idea what the equivalent is of what we read in our text for you and I to do, except to say this, that sometimes being in a desperate situation can be a good thing. And we don't like desperate situations. Desperation feels very uncomfortable, especially for those of us who like to control. Because when you're in a desperate situation, you have no control. But I always find truth and encouragement from these words from Ruth Haley Barton as she writes about desperation. She says, "As strange as it may sound, desperation is a really good thing in the spiritual life. Desperation causes us to be open to radical solutions, willing to take all manner of risk in order to find what we are looking for." She says, "Desperate ones seek with an all-consuming intensity, for they know that their life depends on it." And so I don't know exactly what this looks like for you and I, except to say this, that if you find yourselves in a desperate situation, don't numb yourself to that feeling. Don't try to suppress that. Don't try to run away from it. Let it guide you to pursue with an all-consuming intensity that which you truly long for and are looking for. Because you may find yourself following the paths of Tamar, somebody whose righteous act carries on and reverberates throughout history. And we see this in the reality that she's listed in the lineage to Jesus, something that nobody there at that time could ever imagine, that her righteous act reverberates all the way to the coming of God in the flesh. But even in addition to that, in the shorter future, her family is celebrated. Her family is looked to as a good and blessed thing that has happened. In a few weeks, we're going to look at the story of Ruth, and it's a similar story, right? It's the story of a foreign woman brought into the people of Israel, and she's going to have a child just like Tamar had a child. And when Ruth has a child, they'll say to that child, "May his family be like the family of Perez." that what Tamar's son, Perez, goes on to have a great family, plays a significant role in the history of Israel, and they go, may Ruth's son have the same thing. And this is the sliver of grace in our text, is how one righteous act reverberates throughout history, even if we can't see it in the moment. But I don't want us to just see a sliver of grace in the midst of our heartache. I want us to see the whole picture. And we actually can see the whole picture of grace if we zoom out on our text and see where it uniquely falls in the book of Genesis. So we read Genesis 38. If you flip back to Genesis 37, we actually read part of the story of Joseph. As the kids told us, right, Joseph is one of the younger of the 12. He has this dream that he's going to rule over his siblings, and his siblings don't like it. They fake his murder. They throw him in the pit. They get him out. They sell him to slavery. In chapter 37, it ends right at that moment, where we read that Joseph is sold as a servant to the family of Potiphar. And then that story is interrupted by our story about Tamar. We're at this point with Joseph wondering what's going to happen to him. He's had these great dreams, and his brothers have done these terrible things. What's going to happen to him? It doesn't look good. And then we read this story about Tamar. And we start to see this truth, that what others have intended for evil, God can use for good. That when we face the disappointments from the hand we're dealt, from the laws of the land, from the people around us, even though they intended it for evil, God can use it for good. And so we go back to the story of Joseph in chapter 39, and we read it with expectation. We read it going, I don't know all the details of this story, but I know God is able to use what others intend for evil for good. And what's true of Joseph is even more true for us, that while we don't know the details of our stories, we do know that God will use for good what anyone intends for evil. And this is the power of the season of Advent. This is the power of reading these familiar stories, of reading these familiar texts, of singing these familiar songs, is that our story is a bit like Joseph's in Genesis 37. It's not over. We don't know how it will end. But we hear these songs, we hear these stories, the story of God taking on human flesh, the story of God becoming one of us, of coming down into our heartbreak and disappointment, our moments of grief and loss, and he raises us up in him. And because we know that story, the story of love poured out, the story of Jesus taking on himself on the cross, all the grief, all the disappointment, all the pain. The story of the one raised from the grave who has victory over death itself. We then can continue in our own story, knowing that God can use for good what anyone intends for evil. So what might this look like for you and I this week? Well, one is to take some time and acknowledge your disappointment to God. This isn't about just focusing on the negative and being pessimistic. It's just about being honest. That there are things that have not gone how we wanted them to go, and offering it to the only one who can heal us and hears us. Second is, in the midst of that, consider what is the righteous act that God is calling me, inviting me to do in the midst of my disappointment. And third is to rejoice in the end of the story. To rejoice that we know how things will end. We know the story of Jesus, the one who's raised from the dead. The one who is powerful enough to show us that God can use for good what any intends for evil. And as we embrace this story for ourselves, we cannot but help share this and proclaim this to others. To me, one of the most important Christmas songs that the church ever sings is Go Tell It on the Mountain. Because the good news of God taking on human flesh is so good that we cannot but help share it with others. Because if we look around at our world, we see a world full of disappointment. We see a world full of people crushed and weighed down by heartache over grief and loss and pain. We see them driving to and from work, to and from the stores, going about their lives. And our lives, our task is to proclaim to them, don't you know that God has come and he will come again? Don't you know that Jesus has defeated death? That one day he will come again and wipe away every tear from every eye? Don't you know that one day you and I and all the world will know disappointment no more? Don't you know? Let me pray for us.